Hello, and welcome back, my fellow Lovecraftians. Today we're going to be reading a script from Robert E. Howard, one of H.P. Lovecraft's dearest friends. They even drawed inspiration from each other to write similar stories, and they grew up together. So I'm really excited to introduce you to a lesser known author that really terrifies. We're going to read one of my favorites today, called The Fearsome Touch of Death. As long as midnight clocks the earth, with shadows grim and stark, God save us from this Judas kiss of a dead man in the dark. Old Adam Farrell lay dead in the house wherein he had lived alone for the last 20 years. A silent, cheerless recluse in his life. He had no known friends, and only 2 men had watched his passing. Dr. Stein rose and glanced out the window into the gathering dusk. "You think you can spot and spend the night here, then?" he asked his companion. This man, Farrell by name, assented. "Yes, certainly. I guess it is up to me. Rather a useless and primitive custom, sitting up with the dead," commented the doctor, preparing to depart. "But I suppose, in common decency, we will have to follow procedure. Maybe I can find someone who will come over here and help you with your vigil." Farrell shrugged his shoulders. "I doubt it, Farrell. Wasn't liked, wasn't known by many people. I scarcely knew him myself, but I don't mind sitting up with the corpse." Dr. Stein was removing his rubber gloves, and Farrell watched the process with an interest that almost amounted to fascination. A slight, involuntary shudder shook him at the memory of touching these gloves, slick, cold, clammy things, like the touch of death. "You may get lonely tonight if I don't find anyone," the doctor remarked as he opened the door. "Not superstitious, are you?" Farrell laughed, scarcely. "To tell the truth, from what I heard of Farrell's disposition, I'd rather be watching his corpse than have his guest in life." The door closed, and Farrell looked up his vigil. He seated himself in the only chair the room boasted, glanced casually at the formless, sheeted bulk on the bed opposed to him, and began to read by the light of the dim lamp which stood on the rough table. Outside, the darkness gathered swiftly, and finally Farrell laid down his magazine to rest his eyes. He looked again at the shape which had, in life, been the form of Adam Farrell, wondering what quick in the human nature made the sight of a corpse not so unpleasant. But such an object of fear to man, unthankfully ignorant, seen in dead things, a reminder of death to come. He decided lazily and began idly contemplating as to what life has led and held for this grim and crabbed old man, who had neither relatives nor friends, and who had seldom left the house wherein he had died. The usual tales of miser-hoarded wealth had accumulated, but Farrell felt so little interest in the whole matter that it was not even necessary for him to overcome any temptation to pray about the house for possible hidden treasure. He returned to his readings with a shrug. The task was more boresome than he had thought for. After a while, he was aware that every time he looked up from his magazine and his eyes fell upon the bed with its grim occupant, he stared involuntarily, as if he had for an instant forgotten the presence of the dead man, and was unpleasantly reminded of the fact. The start was slight and instinctive, but he felt almost angered at himself. He realized, for the first time, the utter and deadening silence, which, of course, enwrapped the house. A silence apparently shared by the night, for no sounds came through the window. Adam Farrell lived as far apart from his neighbors as possible, and there was no other house within hearing distance. Farrell shook himself as if rid his mind of the unsavory speculations, and went back to his reading. A sudden, vagrant gust of wind whipped through the windows, in which the light in the lamp flickered and went out. Suddenly, Farrell, cursing softly, groped in the darkness for matches. Burning his finger on the lamp chimney, he struck a match, lighted the lamp, and then glancing over at the bed, got a horrible mental jolt. Adam, and in the gnarled gray features, even as Farrell instinctively shuddered. His reason explained the apparent phenomenon. The sheet that covered the corpse had been carelessly thrown across the face, and then suddenly a puff of wind had disarranged and flung it aside. Yet there was something grisly about the thing, something fearsomely suggestive, as if the cloaking dark, a dead hand had flung aside the sheet, just as if the corpse was about to rise. Farrell, an imaginative man, shrugged his shoulders at these ghastly yet sinister thoughts, and crossed the room to replace the sheet. The dead eyes seemed to stare malevolently, with an evilness that transcended the dead. The workings of a vivid imagination, Farrell knew. He recovered the gray face shrinking as his hands chanced to touch the cold flesh, slick and clammy, the touch of death. He shuddered with a natural revulsion of the living for the dead, and went back to his chair and magazine. At last, growing sleepy, he lay down upon a couch. By some strange whim of the original owner, formed part of the room's scant furnishings, and composed himself for slumber. He decided to leave the light burning, telling himself that it was accordance with the usual custom of leaving lights burning for the dead, for he was not willing to admit to himself that he already knew. He was conscious of a dislike for lying in the darkness with the corpse. He dozed, awoke with a start, and looked at the sheets formed on the bed. Silence reigned over the house, and outside it was very dark. The hour was approaching midnight, with its accompanying eerie domination over the human mind. Farrell glanced again at the bed where the body lay, and he found the sight of the sheeted object most repellent. A fantastic idea burst in his mind and grew, that beneath the sheet, the mere lifeless body had become a strange, monstrous thing, a hideous, conscious being that watched him with eyes which burned through the fabric of the cloth. This thought, a mere fantasy, of course, he explained to himself by the legends of vampires, undead, ghosts, and such alike, the fearsome attributes with which the living have cloaked the dead for countless ages, since primitive man first recognized in death something horrid and apart from life. Man feared death, though faltered in some of his fear of death, took hold on the deed, so that they too were feared. And the sight of the dead engurged grisly through grave rise dim fears of hereditary memory, lurking back in the dark corners of the brain. At any rate, that silent, hidden thing was getting on his nerves. He thought of uncovering the face, of the principle that familiarity breeds contentment. The sight of the features calm and still in death would banish his thought all such wild conjunctions as were haunting him in spite of himself. But the thought of those dead eyes staring in the lamplight was intolerable. So at last he blew out the light and lay down. This fear had been stealing upon him so insidiously and gradually that he had not been aware of its growth. With the extinguishing of the light, however, and the bolting out of the proportions, and Farrell fell asleep almost instantly. On his lips, a faint smile of previous folly. He awakened suddenly. How long had he been asleep? He did not know. He sat up, his pulse pounding frantically, the cold sweats beating on his forehead. He knew instantly where he was, remembered the other occupant in the room. But what had awakened him? A dream, yes. Now he remembered a hideous dream in which the dead man had risen from the bed and stalked stiffly across the room with eyes of fire and horrid leer frozen on his great lips. Farrell had seemed to lie motionless, helpless. Then, as the corpse reached a gnarled and horrible hand, he had awakened. He strove to pierce the gloom, but the room was all blackness, and all without was so dark that no gleam of light came through the window. He reached a shaking hand towards the lamp, then recoiled, as if from a hidden serpent. Sitting here in the dark with a fiendish corpse was bad enough, but he dared not light the lamp, for fear that his reason would be snuffed out like a candle at what he might see. Horror, stark and unreasoning, had full possession on his soul. He no longer questioned the instinctive fears that rose in him. All those legends he had heard came back to him, and brought a belief in them. Death was a hideous thing, a brain-shattering horror, emboldening lifeless men with a horrid malevolence. Adam Farrell, in his life, had been simply a churlish but harmless man. Now he was terror, a monster, a fiend lurking in the shadows of fear, ready to leap on mankind with talons dipped deep in death and insanity. Farrell sat there, his blood freezing, and fought out his silent battle. Faint glimmerings of reason had begun to touch his fright, when a soft, stealthy sound again froze him. He did not recognize it, as if the whisper of the night wind across the windowsill. His frenzied fancy knew it only as the dread of death and horror. He sprang from the couch, then stood, undecided. Escape was in his mind, but he was too dazed to even try to formulate a plan of escape. Even his sense of direction was gone. Fear had so stifled his mind, he was not able to think consciously. The blackness spread in long waves about him, and as darkness the void entered into his brain. His motions, such as they were instinctive. He seemed shackled with mighty change, and his limbs responded sluggishly, like an imbecile's. A terror horror grew up to him and reared its grisly shape, that the dead man was behind him, was stealing upon him from the rear. He no longer thought of lighting the lamp. He no longer thought of anything. Fear filled his whole being. There was room for nothing else. He backed slowly away in the darkness, hands behind him, instinctively feeling the way. With a terrific effort, he partly shook the clinging mist of horror from him, and then cold sweats, clammy upon his body, strove to orient himself. He could see nothing, but the bed was across the room, in front of him. He was backing away from it. There was where the dead man was lying. According to all rules of nature, if the thing were, as he felt, behind him, then the old tales were true. Death did implant in lifeless bodies of unearthly animation, and dead men did roam the shadows to work their ghastly and evil will upon the sons of men. Then, great God! What was man but a wailing infant, lost in the night and beset by frightened things from the black abyss, in the terrible unknown voids of space and time, the consciousness he did not reach by any voids of space and time. These conclusions he did not reach by any reasoning process. They leaped full-grown into his terror-dazed brain. He worked his way slowly backwards, groping, clinging to the thought that the dead man must be in front of him. Then his back-flung hand encountered something slick, cold, and clammy, like the touch of death. A scream shook the echoes, followed by the crash of a falling body. The next morning, they who came to the house of death found 2 corpses in the room. Adam Farrell's sheetless body lay motionless upon the bed, and across the room lay the body of Falred. Beneath the shelf where Dr. Stein had absent-mindedly left his gloves, rubber gloves, slick and clammy to the touch of a hand groping in the dark, a hand of one fleeing his own fear. Rubber gloves, slick and clammy and cold, just like the touch of death. And that is the complete work of The Touch of Death by Robert E. Howard. You can see why it's one of my favorite The story building is intense, and the fact that they use the title a few times really adds to the layer of just how unprepared this man was, and how his fascinations led to his demise. I really like the use of the two names paralleling too. It almost made it hard to read, but it really puts into the fact that they're two sides of the same coin. Life and death, feral and Farrell, both of them living their lives, one loved and one forgotten. The parallels that unite them also separate them, because death isn't a thing of unity. It's something that comes for us all. Leave your likes, comments, and if you'd like to, a follow. I love to hear what your theories are and how you interpreted the story. Until next time, bye-bye.